Well, I customarily work in the area of grand strategy, which is generally seen as a subcomponent of international security. Grand strategy is largely defined in terms of the ends, ways, and means that a state organizes its highest order of thinking in terms of foreign policy. Ends normally means the objectives that states have. Ways are often defined in terms of the instruments that states use, and the means obviously refers to the processes and resources that states use to achieve their goals. In the realm of international relations and public policy, this is largely defined in terms of what we refer to as a realist paradigm. From that perspective, states are normally seen as being the only important actors. And the real purpose for them of a grand strategy is to think about the world in terms of the fighting and winning, preparation, fighting and winning of wars. That's a rather narrow definition. It's one we refer to as a classical definition because it dates back to the work largely of theorists like von Clausewitz. In the context of the 21st century, that kind of approach really doesn't seem to capture the dynamics of the global system. And when you start thinking about it in terms of actors like the European Union, it largely disqualifies for thinking about the European Union in terms of being an actor in that realm, because it's not a state, and it doesn't have a large military presence. So that classical position is faced with an alternative perspective, and that alternative perspective has a much broader definition of grand strategy, in which we look at actors as not necessarily being states. They can be intergovernmental organizations, for example, in which there is an answer to Henry Kissinger's famous adage about, well, when you phone Europe, nobody answers the phone. You think about it in terms of the European Union, and you adopt a whole different set of assumptions about the fact that grand strategy can be as much about peace and development, about climate change or trade, in terms of the actor trying to achieve goals to the welfare of the populations that it serves. In that sense, grand strategy is far more than the fighting and winning of wars. It relates to dealing with a whole series of threats and opportunities that we face in the 21st century, beyond the classic kinetic threats of war and violence, to include elements that we can characterize as anthropogenic threats, threats that are man-made but not intended as threats, like climate change, or naturogenic threats like pandemics. It also applies to opportunities, thinking about how to deal with these kinds of problems, how to deal with climate change in terms of the development of strategies that accord to that. And thus, faced with this classical position, an alternative position, we can start to think about the European Union as an organization that is capable of strategizing. Certainly, the sort of classic position is that the EU is incapable of strategizing because of the internal divisions that it faces amongst its member states. But what our work tries to unearth in my co-authored project with Richard Higgard is to try and understand under what conditions can the European Union be an effective geopolitical actor. Complementing that kind of question is the new EU onus on strategic autonomy. Much has been written about that issue. Most of the work that's written focuses on the security sector and attempts to consider the question whether the EU is capable or could be capable of working in the military domain. It's not surprising that most of that work in Brussels, whether it emanates from think tanks or outside Brussels, whether it emanates from academics, concludes that the EU is really incapable of being an effective security actor. And certainly the current conflict, or potential conflict, I should say, with Russia sort of highlights the incapacity of the European Union to aggregate its resources. But if you think of the world beyond that narrow security domain, and you ask the question, well, how can the European Union deal with the two titans of America on the one hand and China on the other? Then the evidence beyond security becomes very interesting. The temptation is to think of the world as bifurcating towards a sort of traditional Cold War bipolar structure in which Europe has to choose on the one hand between allying itself with the United States or allying itself with China exclusively. But in fact, our work suggests that what we're looking at is a much messier bifurcation. It's one in which an organization like the European Union can choose to side with one side or the other, or indeed pursue an independent strategy depending on the policy domain. And so when you take, for example, an issue like traditional security, it's quite clear that Europe sides with, or will have to side with, the United States because of its lack of military resources and of course its ties, institutional ties through NATO. Moving beyond that domain, however, reveals a more complex and a more interesting pattern. We published a piece in the LSE's Ideas website in which we explored beyond security and looked at the pattern of behavior of the European Union in other critical policy domains. What we discovered was quite interesting. If we take the example of trade, where the European Union's member states have enormous resources, they are really a heavyweight in the global economic system, we discover that the EU begins to take a much more independent position from either China or the United States. The original agreement with the Chinese to have a free trade agreement was negotiated, but then the EU withdrew on the basis of concerns about human rights, to a lesser extent Taiwan. On the other hand, in contrast, there was a concern with the United States. There has been a long-running concern with the United States about the protectionist policies introduced initially under the Trump administration and to a large extent sustained, perhaps surprisingly, under the Biden administration, under the guise of American concerns about developing domestic supply chains in the context of the pandemic. And so that there's a residual concern that the United States will remain an unreliable partner. And so in the area of trade, the European Union has modestly struck out on its own, demonstrating far more autonomy or independence than one would necessarily anticipate based on its traditional free trade relationship with the United States. In the context of climate change, the Europeans, with the development of a green plan, have again been willing to coalesce with the Chinese at times, were understandably far more concerned about the Trump administration's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. And although Biden has expressed a desire to pursue leadership in the area of climate change, the Europeans have been quite steadfast in pursuing their own line. It's perhaps in the area of digitalisation that the Europeans have demonstrated the greatest propensity towards strategic autonomy, largely over issues of, for example, privacy. It's very interesting, you know, in the United States, when I'm there, you are asked to accept cookies when you get on a website. Here, it's far more flagrant and explicit about your capacity to turn down these cookies. That's because Europeans have really developed a very specific and evident concern about privacy that you simply don't see in the United States and certainly don't see in China. European regulators have been very willing to punish what we call the Ang Fang titans of American technology, while also sustaining an independent line from Chinese state-sponsored companies like Huawei. And so our work seeks to move beyond the sort of traditional perspective in which there's a question about European strategic autonomy, which seemingly begins and ends with military security. It seeks to look at European diplomatic capacity and economic capacity and ask and answer the question, under what conditions, where, how, why, Europe may be able to demonstrate autonomy in different kinds of policy domains that will serve European populations well into the future.